if you read the whole of the Bible, it is radically pro-women in an just unusual way. I mean, that's where we zoom out and get the big context.
Yeah.
It is just radical, and we don't have time to explain all of that. But New Testament, Old Testament, especially if you consider the time and era that it was written in, if you throw that in the mix as well, it is uniquely female honoring, glorifying, protecting, encouraging. It wasn't until women were created that God said, it's very good now. Back in Genesis,
Good point. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or afternoon or evening. It's morning for us. We never film in the morning. Right. I feel disoriented, a little angsty and grumpy.
Perfect, because we will be disoriented with a wheel.
And look at that segue. It's 7 a.m. and you got us from I'm disoriented to we're going to be in a passage that's disoriented. You know what, guys? And I don't even pay her for this. I don't pay her.
He doesn't pay me at all.
I've never given her a dime, to be honest with you. We don't even share bank accounts.
Okay, so get to the passage. Come on.
Okay, here we go. So again, reminder for you newcomers, clearly this season, we're calling it clearly cold turkey, which means we are finding out with you what the heck we're doing, what the text is. We're spinning a little spinny wheel of destiny. And we are going to, hopefully, it's going to help you see like, hey, here's some good questions to come to a text that maybe you're unfamiliar with as you're studying so that you can feed yourself God's word, understand it for yourself. Is that a fair recap?
Yep. So let's get going.
Kelly's like, shut your mouth and just spin the wheel. It's fine. You know what? I want to have relational connection with you, dear listener. And
if this were the other
Kelly's
way around.
all business. Okay. It's 7 a.m. Cut us some slack for crying out loud. Here we go. Spinny wheel of
Are you
destiny.
doing it this time?
No, you spin it. Okay.
I think I did it last time.
20.
Where's envelope 20?
Here we go.
Are you doing it?
Are you going to do it? No, you did it last time.
I
How
did.
dare you try to steal my glory? Okay. Open by the mic. Authentic. Real.
Wow.
And the passage is, I'm kind of scared. 7 a.m. I don't know what I can handle. Oh man.
Gosh.
Okay. 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 12, which means nothing maybe to some of you, but to others of you who are into head coverings, it means all kinds of things. Okay. So here we are. Cigarette? No? Just me?
Wow.
Okay.
So I'm covering this one? See what I did there?
Oh, you're covering this one. Guys, it's 7 a.m. and she did a head covering joke. That is amazing. I'm so proud of you. Kiss me.
Really?
Love.
Okay.
Yesterday was Valentine's Day for us.
It was. Okay. So can we let's get going.
Okay. 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 12. So should we read it first?
I actually know, some of these passages we're more familiar with, but this one for sure, as a female who cares very deeply about the Bible and wanting to live by it, this passage actually is one I'm familiar with. Doesn't mean I have all the answers. I just mean I read it sometimes and go, am I supposed to be covering my head in worship? Like I want to be submissive to the word of God. And it is a challenging passage because anyway.
This was the first or second most written in request for us to tackle. So a number of you guys are like, yeah, what do you do with that? And it is in the Bible, which means it matters. It carries authority and weight. So we need to figure out what the heck's going on.
Yeah. Can I read part of it?
Context, or do you want to read the 12 verses?
We can give a quick
verses?
context, as this is in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church, which is full of I feel like a lot of basics maybe. There's just a lot of like reset, like how should we operate as believers in the church? They had a lot of problems, we may know that. But in 1 Corinthians 11, we're getting near the end of the book, and it's dealing a lot with gender. So
yes.
Is that okay?
That'll do.
Can I read part of it?
Yeah. We're going to be reading out of the New American Standard, so don't be scared. Go ahead. You good?
Yep.
All right.
Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions, just as I delivered them to you. That's Paul speaking to the church. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. And every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head, but every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head.
For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. There's more in the text about head coverings, but that gives you a sense of what the conversation is.
So anytime I'm coming to passages like this one, and I've read this one many times and been like, okay, because of the angels, what? When you're coming to something like confusing, I don't have answers. I don't have time to read 45 commentaries and articles about this thing, but this is in my devotional reading, right? This is what the Lord has set before me in my Bible reading. Maybe there are usually still things that can strengthen and encourage our hearts, even when things are still cloudy to us. So, let me just give you an example. As we were reading this, something that stuck out to me, and that has always stuck out to me in this passage, is that Paul says, let's see, in verse 5, every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. Paul assumes women are praying and prophesying. That's an assumed thing. So even though I don't understand a lot of other things in this passage, that actually encourages me to go, all right, Paul, you see men and women together in the church being doing the work of gathering together in the body, praying together, prophesying. So we could talk about that for a whole episode, what that means. But he sees them as an active participant in the church community.
Yep.
It's an assumed thing. So it's not,
good observation,
should women do that? It's, they will be. Here's how to operate in that. And so even if you're like, I'm confused about other things, I'm usually asking myself, well, what can I know from this? What can I see? And that's a
great observation.
That's one thing in this passage that is strengthening to me.
Another thing, again, we're trying to give you guys resources for how do you come to disorienting texts or things like that and not lose your minds or your faith. Another great practice is to never read a text in a vacuum. So the whole you've got 2 verses you're studying, but nothing of the context, that's a problem. That's bad Bible study. You don't read any other book really like that.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly don't read narrative or story like that. Nobody's jumping to the middle of Sense and Sensibility and going, I understand the whole thing now. Why did I pick that? Probably
Sense and Sensibility.
Because I'm so refined,
so
Kelly,
romantic.
that those are my go-to books. I don't know about you. Probably reading some
You have not read
Malcolm Gladwell, but me, it's the deep things.
Anyway.
So here's a question that I'm asking. By the way, holding a pencil, I feel so scholastic. I'm going, what context is this set in? Mm-hmm. And so it's going to make me want to read the chapter before, this whole chapter, and the chapter after. And as you kind of work your way through this back half of 1 Corinthians, it's worth noting Paul's interest in these chapters here is all about proper operational procedure for life in the local church, in the gathered moments of the local church. So for instance, many of you know chapters 12, 13, and 14 because those are all the chapters on the spiritual gifts. And those spiritual gifts are being articulated in the local assembly. How are we to operate with one another? Should prophecy be happening, tongues be happening, those sorts of things? And if so, how should they be doing that? So chapter 11 is also going to fit in that contextual space. It is talking about what gender relations should look like, feel like, be like in the local church assembly. And you pointed out, I think it's a great observation that contextually speaking, we're talking about head coverings as it pertains to a woman praying and prophesying in the local church gathering. So this is not necessarily a communication about every space that a woman exists in every context. This is about how it something that ought to be conveyed or communicated in the church gathering. Is that fair?
Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Better Man. Better Man is helping men everywhere have a clear biblical vision of manhood that changes everything. You could check them out at betterman.com. That is betterman.com.
The head covering moment in particular is related to church activity when there is more than one gender present.
Yes.
Right? It's like this is a communal moment together. It's specifically dealing with that. Now, Paul's making other statements about women and men to make his argument, but it is specifically related to that gathering moment, which, again, at a minimum, that's always before I even get to, okay, should I be covering my head when I go to church or not? Before I even get to that question, there's other things still for me to notice, like when we're in a church context, my gender matters. Female, male, that distinction is important.
That's right.
So at a minimum.
So take that, 2024.
At a minimum, that's true. I can know that. And
that's a great point. So one of the things that I'm gonna want to settle early on in these tough passages. So take this one for example. Is okay. What is the command and its extent? Like how far does it reach? And we get the command really in verse 6. Let her cover her head, and we get the extent of it in verse 5 when a woman is praying and prophesying. Right, so we're sort of getting our boundary markers and the what. What is Paul after? And how far is that meant to reach? So we're talking about head coverings in local church when prayer and prophecy is happening. And then because we're reading Paul, I'm on the lookout for another thing too. I'm on the lookout for his reasoning, his rationale, because Paul almost never drops a bomb without accounting for it.
Right.
Which
is almost the part of this passage that can feel more
offensive,
if I'm being honest, that I've been like, Lord, okay.
Yeah,
anyway.
That's right. So the first thing that I noticed before Paul even makes the ask or gives the command in verse 6, he's already accounting for why what I'm about to tell you ought to be the practice in the church. In verse 3, we see it. It says, but, or now, I want you to understand. So he's about to help us understand something that's going to give us context and rationale for what his ask is about to be. I want you to understand that that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. So put being totally offended by that sentence aside. Paul's making a theological claim, right? So the first thing that I notice when I'm reading this is the top line, the lead argument Paul makes as to why this should be a practice is theological. It's grounded in something bigger than just a cultural reason.
Right.
And this is important because however we're going to end up defining what head covering means or how it should be practiced, we need to know that for Paul, this isn't just something that is particular to the Corinthians.
Right.
Paul's going, hey, there's a spiritual reality up here that's informing our behavior.
Right. Well, and he says something similar later on in the passage. Maybe what I'm thinking of is verse 11 and 12, but he's getting at, woman originates from man from the woman. I mean, all of his argument reasons are bigger than cultural. So it is grounded in something bigger, which again, as a female reading this passage, I begin to ask, so why is no one, my thoughts have often been, the churches I go to, women aren't covering their heads when they're praying. So what am I missing? Because it feels pretty clear at this point as I read it, what is, and I honestly, when we used to tour together, I would have women come up to me after shows and hand me like little pamphlets. They're like, you should have your head covered, and here's why. And I was like, oh.
We played some interesting shows back in the day.
Okay, I need to think about that. But again, as a serious Bible student, and I really want my heart to be submissive to what God says, then that becomes a question that's very practical to me. And it's interesting because Paul also pulls some shame language in there, disgrace, that he's saying it's as if she had her head shaved. So he's even talking about this thing in men and women that it's part of how women and men naturally differentiate themselves from each other in almost every culture, that women grow their hair long and men will keep theirs short.
Why don't we see if we can get a little bit of a sense of what the theological argument is?
Yes. Can I shortcut us here and just go, I know that you have preached on this actually.
Yeah.
And did a lot of research on it. So can you give us like your, minute spiel of what you think is going on here? Because we've both studied this passage and I am not wearing a head covering.
Sure.
So it's
We're also not at church, so.
Well, yes. So explain your reasoning for that.
Yeah, well, I think verse 3 gives a big clue because it tells us some kind of order of something. Christ is the head of every man. The man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. We have to answer the question, what does head mean? I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but that is a question. We can't assume that what we mean by that word is exactly what Paul might have meant. And I'm just going to argue that the word head here, it certainly doesn't mean the cranium.
Physical head.
Yeah. And some people have argued maybe it means source, like the beginning of, but we know that God isn't the beginning of Christ because Christ was never created. He was with God in the beginning. So there's another way to think about the word head, and it's to understand it as authority. That head means authority. And you can see this coming across if you cross-reference this passage with another passage talking about this type of relationship between man and woman. So it's really important we just get this, and then we can kind of settle at least what the theological claim is here. Ephesians 5:22 and 23, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. Now listen to the head language, see if you can spot it. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. So here's the command. Wives, submit yourselves to or be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. And then he gives the reason. For or because, here's why you submit yourselves to your husband. Because the husband is the head of the wife. So do you see how that communicates authority? It's talking about leadership. Language. Yeah, this is about leadership and authority, not value, not quality of person. This is, you can still hold to equality of persons while saying there is a relationship difference between the two. And that's what Paul's saying back in our text. There's a relationship difference between men and women.
Which I think makes a strong argument that Paul here is probably speaking in some ways to husbands and wives in particular, more than just in general, men and women. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think there's arguments that you could make counter to that this is a men and women comment, but the language here, even in the Greek, could be absolutely taken as
wives, cover your heads.
Yes.
Not women. Necessarily.
So there's something about doing this thing, let's just say it's head covering for now, putting this head covering on, that's communicating something about God's design of our relationships. That's what verse 3 is telling me, that there's something that a woman can do in the gathered church that communicates a married woman, that communicates something about the design of her relationship to her husband. That it's meant to say something about the good thing God has done when he created spiritual headship and authority within the marriage covenant and
Right.
within the local church.
Well, and it's almost, if you zoom out a little bit, it's almost an encouragement in this passage of as you come to church, come at within the context of that relationship of husband and wife. That thing is not left at the door, so to speak.
Yeah.
That we enter into the body of believers, and it's not like that goes away. It's like, no, we're entering with that headship and submission, authority element in marriage still intact.
That's good. And so we have to find. So here's what I'm immediately feeling from this passage and getting is we have to find meaningful ways to communicate the relationships God's designed within the church body and then within marriage that helps tell the people around us, I think God did a good thing when he made spiritual headship. I think he did a good thing when he made the relationship between husbands and wives. I think he did a good thing here. And that's what Paul's saying from verse 3. He's saying we need to find meaningful ways to communicate that. But now the question is, well, is head covering a meaningful way?
Right.
In Paul's day, it was, right? Because in Paul's day, it was a practice even not among the church. It was a way to communicate that type of relationship to have a head covering on your head.
Like a wedding ring, possibly, or.
So now we're getting into an interesting space, which is, well, if the point is to find a meaningful way to communicate that God has made the relationships between, say, husband and wife on purpose, and it's a good thing, I got to find a meaningful way to do that. Now I've got this question to ask. Is that a meaningful communication of that reality of spiritual headship in the 21st century?
Right.
In the West, in Texas, in, 2024?
Right. Well, and I could easily hear somebody saying, well, that kind of sounds like the cultural argument that we could apply to so many passages that people do use to go, well, we don't have to live by this anymore because that was Paul's cultural context. But, here's, again, as a woman reading this, one question I have is, well, how come, if it was that important that every single woman in local churches wear a physical head covering into the gathered congregation, praying or prophesying, if it was like it's not cultural, it's unequivocally like we should live that way forever, then why in all of Paul's other letters to churches is it not addressed, even when he's addressing men and women, husbands and wives? Like, I'm not seeing, you see him bring up submission multiple times. It's like, no, that is a norm in the marriage relationship that God designed. That's not, well, that was back then and now we're today. But I don't see him doing that anywhere else, which is why this chapter has always felt so kind of, what are we talking about? Which I do think speaks to likely a unique problem happening in the Corinthian church, because there are other passages in 1st and 2nd Corinthians that aren't addressed other places. And there are things said to really wealthy people in Ephesians where you're like, whoa, they must have had some wealth going on there, because I don't see that language in this other, so these were individual bodies of believers with specific issues that the principles are meant for us today. But my point is just, as I've read it and studied it and asked questions like this, I'm like, well, Paul doesn't carry that argument into every single moment he's talking to wives.
Yeah.
So, is that something I need to do today? Does that mean the answer is no, which I don't think I need to wear a head covering into church, but does that mean I throw out this whole chapter and go, well, that doesn't apply to me? No, God said all scripture is profitable for us, all of it. So then now I'm asking myself, this is what we've been talking about. What are the principles underlying this? That it's actually not important, or it's actually really important for me as I come into my local congregation to come in not only as Kelly, but as Kelly, Jimmy's wife. And it is important for Jimmy to come in, not just as Jimmy, but Jimmy, Kelly's husband, which means I don't see church as an opportunity to cut myself loose from this thing because I'm not happy about it and take my maiden name back up or something and go, no, I'm just me. I don't relate to him. I don't want I don't want you to associate me with that. I don't want this to apply to me here. Take my wedding ring off. I am meant to enter the congregation, yes, as an individual before God. That is a more true identity of me. But I'm currently in a marriage covenant, and that is meant to impact me in the church and outside of the church. And it is a good thing that God designed that I'm meant to receive with gladness. I still have things to learn from this passage, even if I come to the conclusion. I don't think it means I need to actually go buy like a scarf to drape over my head when I walk into the church context.
That's right. I'm so glad you said all that. And I think that is a good summary of how verse 10 ends up coming across, because Paul is, he at least concludes the first part of his argument in verse 10 by giving us a therefore. Therefore, I've said all this. I've told you what you need to do. I've given you some why, some reasons for it. And he says, therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Pause on the because of the angels thing. Paul's crazy, and nobody knows what this means. I've read so many commentaries on it. I don't know. But therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head is Paul's main thesis, right? He's saying this is what needs to happen. Now, in the Greek, the word symbol of isn't there. It just reads the woman ought to have authority on her head. And this is where, for me, this is where I think, we now have permission, biblical permission, to understand that it's the principle that's needing to be conveyed, not the material that's needing to be conveyed.
Right.
I need my wife in the local church needs to be committed to, just like you said, communicating that leadership, covenantal relationship between me and her, as she's living out her life in the local church, and whatever that is, ought to be a culturally significant communication of symbol of authority, the headship thing that we were talking about earlier. Now, you mentioned a couple things in passing. I'll just bring them up to really state them clearly that we do have ways to communicate that in our culture. Symbols of authority that say something about, I'm coming under his leadership, his headship. I'm willingly submitting myself to him, even as I'm in this church context. You named two of them. Wedding rings is a communication of that. And you even mentioned this, taking your husband's last name. That isn't it interesting that even in secular pockets of our culture, that is still a wildly common practice for a woman to take on the name of her husband. It's a way of saying something about the relationship to the husband. And it's so interesting. The data, because I'm weird, I looked all this up for preaching a sermon a long time ago. The data doesn't go the other way. Not too many husbands taking the women's name. Not because it's beneath them, but because there is something, I think, even inherited from sort of the Judeo-Christian worldview that says, no, headship's being communicated here. And so embracing these things and not being brazen with our independence as people and as women in this passage is a way that we get to say God didn't make a mistake when he designed the created order and designed relationships and designed marriage in a certain way to function a certain way.
Right. Yeah? And can I just make a point here that this passage is not just addressing women. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he's the image and glory of God. That it isn't just women, make sure you do this. It's men also. You don't confuse that either. So we don't know what was happening, but he's looking at both genders having something to say and calling both of them to operate within.
To do or not do a thing, to say a thing.
Yeah. And I think, there's even implications in that. It's like the headship means responsibility.
Yeah.
It's like men.
Yeah.
You have responsibility to your spouse in the church context.
That's good. And
you don't get a free pass from dealing with that within the church. So it is written to both. And, many women have come to this passage and felt very discouraged and disheartened and am I less than? It literally says that man is the glory of God and women are the glory of man. And that can feel very really? That feels lame and secondary. So I just want to say, just kind of even in closing talking about this, if you read the whole of the Bible, it is radically pro-women in an just unusual way. I mean, that's where we zoom out and get the big context.
Yeah.
It is just radical. And we don't have time to explain all of that. But New Testament, Old Testament, especially if you consider the time and era that it was written in, if you throw that in the mix as well, it is uniquely female honoring, glorifying, protecting, encouraging. I mean, especially even in this passage, we're assuming she is a partner in ministry in the church, active participant in the local body. And so that helps me as I read this and I'm asking God questions and wrestling with my own feelings of what does that mean for me, that I can know, no, it wasn't until women were created that God said, it's very good now. Back in Genesis,
Good point.
It's like Genesis 2, when that moment happens, it's like things are real good now. And, I just need to keep that in mind and keep a posture of belief in God's goodness toward me as a female as I read and ask him questions about this passage. So I just think that's important. If you took it in isolation, you could feel discouraged.
Yeah.
If you look at the whole of the book, it's like, no, I'm convinced he's for me and he's good.
And I just want to say, babe, now that you're here in my life, things are real good.
Well, you probably wouldn't have had a music career.
I probably wouldn't
without
have had
me.
a kid either. That's true. Well, way to make it awkward. Okay.
1 Corinthians 11.
There we go. Thanks again for joining us today, guys. We appreciate you.
If you have a friend, who's super interested in head coverings or
You know
1
that
Corinthians
friend.
11,
We don't need to say who it is.
share this episode with them. Send it on. But really, if you do think it would be helpful, those difficult passages, uncovering them, send it on. Share it with a friend. And if you're not already subscribed to the podcast, make sure you subscribe to stay up to date with us. In the show notes, you can find a link to our email list to make sure you're up to date in that way. And then we'd love for you to join our team. Help make this show possible with us for as little as $5 a month. You can go find that link as well in the show notes.
All right. We love y'all. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.